Good evening, everyone, and welcome officially to our 10th annual Happy Birthday Hamilton celebration, virtual this year. We are so glad they're able to join us. My name is Nicole Chalet, and I'm the president of the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, also known as the AHA Society. And we are a national nonprofit dedicated to educating about the life and legacy of Alexander Hamilton and his era of the founding period. And on behalf of the AHA Society Board, I again want to thank you for joining us along with our many partners, including the Museum of American Finance, the Hamilton Partnership for Paterson, Revolutionary NYC, the St. Andrew Society of the State of New York, the First Families of New York, the Lexington Historical Society, StatutesandStories.com, and the Morris-Jumel Mansion for the 10th annual Happy Birthday Hamilton. It was actually 10 years ago today that I, along with the late president, Rand Chalet of the AHA Society, went to Hamilton's grave at Trinity Church in Lower Manhattan in New York City on the anniversary of what was then believed to be his birthday of January 11th. We'll get more into today that we don't actually know the official date. But it was there that we first participated in an observance for Alexander Hamilton's birthday. And the following year, the AHA Society took on the mantle of having celebrations and commemorations for Hamilton's birth and death every January and July for the past 10 years. And so we do thank you for joining us to continue the tradition albeit virtually, and we invite you to learn more about us and our partners at the ahasociety.org, and we'd love to have you connect with us, and both in the chat this evening as well as through our social media and website. I want to say that the tradition of the format for today's event, a roundtable, actually began at Hamilton Grange National Memorial, which is Hamilton's home in northern Manhattan. And it is today a national park site, and the AHA Society, as official nonprofit partners to the Grange, work to help put on programming about Hamilton's life. And we came up with this concept of really allowing the public to come and ask their questions and engage and have access to scholars and authors on Hamilton of all backgrounds. And it's one of our missions as the AHA Society to really make the latest information and the most engaging information available to everyone. And so I truly want to thank all of our speakers that are joining us this evening and providing their incredible expertise, decades and decades of work towards Hamilton's legacy and life, which we'll hear more about. And so again, I want to thank you for joining us this evening, and I'm going to turn it over to Vice President Sergio Villavicencio to introduce our panel of esteemed guests. Thank you.
It is an honor to be able to be celebrating Alexander Hamilton's birthday with such an incredible, stellar group of experts on Alexander Hamilton. We have Richard Brookhiser, Douglas Hamilton, Stephen Knott, Michael E. Newton, Robert Wright. I have listed them in alphabetical order, and that's how I'm going to be approaching. We are going to be presenting one or two questions to each of the speakers. Then we're going to be presenting some open questions so they can provide their thoughts, each one of them, about a common topic. And then we will open the ground for interactions with the public. The first panelist that we have tonight is Mr. Richard Brookhiser. He's the author of Founding Father, Rediscovering George Washington and the Way of the Wasp. He has also edited and annotated Washington Rules of Civility. He's a senior editor at the National Review and the New York Observer columnist. And for all the Hamiltonians in the room, he's also very well known as the person who started, if you want to call it that way, the revival of Alexander Hamilton toward the end of the 90s. Mr. Brookheiser, you were at the forefront of spearheading the revival of Alexander Hamilton with your book, Alexander Hamilton American, in 1999, and also the Hamilton exhibit at the New York Historical Society. What about Hamilton inspired you?
Well, my first biography of a founding father had been about George Washington. and that came out in 1996. It was called Founding Father Rediscovering George Washington. And I think I took a path that other people have taken. I know that James Thomas Flexner also followed it. He was a great Washington biographer, and then he went on to write a rather odd biography of Alexander Hamilton, but a very passionate one. And I think if you come at the founders via Washington, Hamilton is a likely next stop. I mean, Washington knows everybody. He works with everybody. Almost everybody esteems him. I think the only people in that generation who didn't were Timothy Pickering and Aaron Burr. But, everybody else reveres George Washington. But the relationship that he had with Hamilton was extremely long. It became extremely close, and it was really the last significant partnership that he had. His partnership with James Madison ended in political division at least halfway through his presidency. With Hamilton, it lasted till the end of his life. And I was struck by the moment in the newspaper war. This is when the animosities in Washington's cabinet break out into journalistic fights during his first term. And, Hamilton is attacking Jefferson using pseudonyms, and Jefferson is subsidizing or helping to back a newspaper which attacks Hamilton and the administration. And Washington is reading all this journalism in Philadelphia, and he finally writes a letter to both these guys, his Secretary of Treasury and Secretary of State, and says, what's going on, and cut it out. And Hamilton's response was, well, yes, I've written these pieces, and if you want me to stop, I'll stop, so long as Jefferson also stops. Then Jefferson's answer was, I haven't written anything. But I'm glad these pieces are coming out, because Hamilton is a really bad guy, and somebody somebody has to tell America that. And I just contrasted these two responses, and I thought, well, which one of these men do I like better? And it was Hamilton. So he's the one I went with. And then, also the life is just so dramatic. I mean, almost melodramatic. It's an unbeatable arc. So that's why I went on to him.
Thank you so much. That is there any particular memory that you have of the exhibit at the New York Historical Society?
Oh, well, that was interesting, because of course that's a collaboration. I mean, when you're writing a book, yes, you get help from a lot of people, but it's your job, and you're in the spotlight. But with an exhibition as huge as that, it is a collaboration. And James Basker was an indispensable help, the professor at Barnard and president of the Gilder Lehrman Institute. And he was a terrific help in setting that exhibition up. And we brought in an excellent design team. We got good help from the New York Historical Society itself, which just has so much stuff. Whenever anybody in a fancy New York family died, they gave stuff to the New York Historical Society. So they just have papers and documents and records. And I think the moment that sticks out most in my mind, the first room we had in the exhibit, I thought of it as Hamilton's brain, because it was portraits of everybody in his life that we could round up. And these were people who were huge in his life, and sometimes people that he just encountered, briefly and in passing. And some of these were excellent paintings, and some of them were pretty mediocre paintings. But, we had to have them because that was the best we could get. And there were two sculptures. One was a bust of Hamilton by a New York carpenter. I mean, just an unknown as a sculptor. I mean, so unknown that I've forgotten his name now, but he did a nice bust. Then there was the famous bust by the French sculptor Houdon of Jefferson. So I'm taking my wife around this room, just pointing out all the faces. And she comes to the Jefferson bust and she says to me, I don't trust this guy. And I thought, well, Hamilton would probably agree with you there.
Thank you so much, Mr. Brookheiser. Next, we have a descendant. We have Douglas Hamilton, who is Alexander Hamilton's fifth great-grandson. He is also an Alexander Hamilton advocate. Douglas Hamilton works to educate the younger generations about the accomplishments of Alexander Hamilton and support other advocates of early American history. Douglas Hamilton has been an incredible resource for genealogies and all the people who are studying the family of Alexander Hamilton. Most of us here in the room right now are very familiar with Hamilton's public life. Can you tell us about Hamilton's personal life as a husband and as a father?
Okay, well, yes, thank you again for inviting me tonight. Some may say I'm not a scholar, but I am a Schuyler. So Hamilton as a father and a husband, we have a lot from Hamilton's letters where he often shows his affection and for his wife and concern for the well-being of the kids and his wife. And, if ever he's out of town and there's a child that's sick, he's always getting to Elizabeth and saying, you need to send me more frequent information about how's my little boy, how's my little girl. And, he's always shown compassion for the children. And he never hesitates to offer advice on what to give the children to make them healthy. He's just always making sure that they're safe. And as the kids grow up, he gets involved a little bit in their education. He gives them some ideas. He shares some maxims with them, like, a promise must never be broken. And I think the kids benefit from that, and they have an appreciation for it. With everything that I've seen, from what I can tell, and the kids seem to have all ended up pretty good. I would say overall, he did a very good job as being a father and a husband. Also comes from me that, he wasn't perfect. And in fact, he had a couple situations that I'm sure he regretted significantly, being the Reynolds affair, and also his son's duel, his involvement there. Those were tragic events for Hamilton. And it reflects a little bit on how he was as a parent, I think, and a husband. So, but overall, I think he was a pretty good guy, and he did a good job.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Stephen Knott, who is a professor of National Security Affairs Department at the U.S. Naval War Academy. His books include Washington and Hamilton, The Alliance That Forged America, Alexander Hamilton and the Persistence of Myth, and The Secret and Sanctioned Covert Operations and the American President. Stephen, my first question to you is, why are there so many myths about Alexander Hamilton, and why do they persist so strongly?
Well, thank you, Sergio. Thank you, Nicole, for arranging this event. Grateful to be here. That's a terrific question, one that I've written quite a bit about. And I think at the risk of sounding like I suffer from Jefferson derangement syndrome, which perhaps I do, it starts with Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, and working primarily through his lieutenants, James Madison, James Monroe, John Beckley, and others, really engaged in what I consider to be the first and remarkably effective example of the politics of personal destruction. Richard alluded earlier to the newspaper wars. That's where most of the combat, in a sense, took place. But I do think there was an element, at least coming from the Jeffersonian side, that was very personal. This wasn't just a heated dispute over policies like the bank or foreign policy towards France. This really was a concerted effort to destroy Hamilton politically. And of course, it's no accident that the Reynolds affair, which Douglas just alluded to. It's Beckley and it's Monroe and it's that crowd that makes sure that James Callender gets the story about the Reynolds affair. And that, I think they released that sometime in 1797. I've often speculated that that was an attempt to make sure that Hamilton would sort of be out of the running as a potential presidential candidate in 1800. But beyond that, this was an effort to destroy Hamilton, to destroy the Federalist Party. I mean, Jefferson was very blunt about it in some of his private correspondence. He hoped to sink the Federalists into an abyss from which they shall never emerge. And he succeeded. I mean, I have to give him credit. I think he was one of the greatest sort of political operatives of American history, and far more politically adept than Hamilton or any of the Federalists. So it starts with Jefferson. There's a campaign to portray him as a monarchist or a plutocrat and a monarchist, or if not, just flat out a British agent. Those myths persist into the 19th century. They're circulated by people like Andrew Jackson and some of his lieutenants. They're circulated by the Democratic Party in good measure throughout a good part of the 19th century. Hamilton has some allies in terms of his afterlife. A lot of Republican presidents, particularly Gilded Age presidents like James Garfield and Benjamin Harrison, deeply admired Hamilton. But in the Democratic Party, Hamilton has always been sort of the Darth Vader of the American founding. And Franklin Roosevelt sort of puts the exclamation point on that during the New Deal era. It's Roosevelt who elevates Jefferson into the American pantheon, putting him up there with Washington and Lincoln. It's Roosevelt that puts Jefferson on the nickel, on the most commonly used postage stamp, and of course erects the Jefferson Memorial. And it's Roosevelt who portrays his Republican opponents as Alexander Hamilton's heirs, and does so quite effectively. And again, he portrays Hamilton as a plutocrat, but he also portrays Herbert Hoover and the rest of the 1930s era Republicans as plutocrats as well. So part of the reason for the persistence of so many myths about Hamilton is, in a way, it became a talking point for a major political party that exists to this day. Now, I grant you that party has shifted somewhat over the years, no question. Now, some of Hamilton's opponents are more likely to be found in the libertarian wing of the Republican Party. But nonetheless, he and Jefferson and their great debates have been sustained over the centuries by these two political parties that we have today. And Hamilton, as I said, has always been a villain in the minds of most good Democrats, capital D Democrats.
Thank you so much. Next, we have historian and author Michael E. Newton, who specializes in the American Revolution and the founding era. Michael Newton is a foremost expert on Alexander Hamilton and also the author of The Path to Tyranny, Angry Mobs and Founding Fathers, Alexander Hamilton, The Formative Years, and his latest book, Discovering Hamilton. Michael, and I'm going to share something here that may be a little bit familiar to you. This is a graphic of the research that you published a couple of years ago. Your research shows that Hamilton was probably born between February and August of '54, probably. Why is it that we continue to celebrate Hamilton's birthday on January 18th?
Well, as you said, one of the key words is probably. We have, originally we all thought, everybody thought he was born January 11, 1757. The Rachel Fawcett probate record was found in the 1930s by H.U. Ramsing. And he said, well, January 11th has to be right, but the year is wrong. So the debate shifted. Maybe it's January 11, 1755. And then I found the other two documents in the screenshot, one of which doesn't help us on this precise date, but does show it's not 1757. But the other one suggests that Hamilton was born between August 1753 and August 1754. If you combine it together, Hamilton's born probably between February and August 1754. So why do we celebrate January 11th? And one of the reasons is probably. While we have no reason or little reason to question these documents, we do have Hamilton saying and his family saying his birthday was January 11th. So the question is, well, what if one of these documents is wrong? So what if Rachel Fawcett's probate record, which says Hamilton was 13 years old, what if whoever answered the question, because Hamilton wasn't there, probably his uncle or his cousin, what if they were wrong about the age they gave? What if the person wrote it down wrong? What if they said about 13 and they just wrote 13? So if it's the probate record that's wrong, Hamilton could be born in the part where it says Alexander Hamilton's testimony, he could be born January 11th, 1754. If Hamilton's testimony was recorded incorrectly, or Hamilton said something like, I'm about 17, which he said in 1771, and the person just recorded as 17, then that could be wrong, and the probate record's right, and his birthday would be January 11th, 1755. Now, as I said, there's no little reason to suspect either of them are wrong. So I still go by probably February to August 1754. But if that's right, February to August 1754, what day do we celebrate it? We don't know what day he was born if it's in that range. So if we're going to celebrate a day for his birthday, it might as well be the day that either Hamilton thought he was born or the day Hamilton said he was born. And so we have nothing better to go by than Hamilton's own date of January 11th.
Thank you so much. This is truly fascinating. Next, we have Robert Wright, who is a business, economic, financial, and monetary historian, and the inaugural Rudy and Marilyn Neff Family Chair of Political Economy at Augustana University in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. He is also a research economist at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His books include Hamilton and Bound Finance at the Creation of the American Republic, One Nation Under Debt, Hamilton Jefferson and the History of What We Owe, and Financial Founding Fathers, the Men Who Made America Rich. Mr. Wright, what is one aspect of Hamilton's financial programs that is most often misunderstood or underappreciated?
Well, 21 years ago, I named my firstborn son Alexander. Hamilton was. So his full name is Alexander Hamilton was Wright. And the way my last name is spelled, W-R-I-G-H-T, in English, means a maker of things, as in Cartwright or Wheelwright. And then a couple of years later, the book that you just mentioned that I did with David Cowan, Financial Founding Fathers, used biblical, concepts, and we called Hamilton in that book the creator, because he is the person singly most responsible for creating the America that we know today. And it wasn't a function of any one of the things that he did, but all of them, because they formed a system. So almost all of it's completely misunderstood by most folks, especially those Democrats that Professor Knott mentioned. But they all work together basically to lead America from being a colony down what Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson call the narrow corridor of liberty, to create a shackled Leviathan, a state that's powerful enough to protect Americans from outside foes, from foreign foes, but not so powerful as to limit the liberty of Americans. And from that, we lead to a financial revolution, also spearheaded by Hamilton, to a system of open access entrepreneurship, which was also spearheaded by Hamilton and his help pushing the proliferation of the corporate form. And finally, we end with modern management and administration, which Hamilton also helped to spearhead, first in the Army and then as Treasury Secretary, the Treasury being the largest branch of non-military branch of the government. And a wonderful book by Harvey Flamenhoff, The Effective Republic, describes in detail all of the administrative and managerial innovations that Hamilton made. And very few people can articulate that. They might pick out one or two things that they like or dislike, but because Hamilton himself was one of the few people who can see the forest and at the same time see the details of all the trees and know the difference between elms and oaks and pines and all of that wonderful stuff, but still realize that it's just part of a much larger and greater whole.
Thank you so much. And here comes what everybody's expecting, the open questions. And at this point, please, I would like to invite all the speakers to join in freely and express their opinions about the same topic. So this is a loaded question. Number one, what are the most remarkable differences between Alexander Hamilton and other founding fathers?
Well, he's an immigrant. I mean, there were some immigrants. Robert Morris was, James Wilson was, but he's an immigrant, and he's also from the West Indies, which is pretty rare. I mean, his childhood friend Edward Stevens becomes a doctor here, and he's briefly a consul to Haiti after the Haitian Revolution, but you don't find a lot of other West Indians in the American founding period. So that leaps out to me.
Just to build on what Richard said, I think Hamilton's status as an immigrant at least contributes to his nationalism, for lack of a better word. Richard's biography of Hamilton was titled Alexander Hamilton, American. And I think of all that founding generation, maybe George Washington's a close second. It's Hamilton that envisions this country as a nation and hopes to convince his fellow citizens to believe in themselves as Americans, to drop the idea that they're citizens of New York or citizens of Virginia, and to truly, try to forge an American identity. And in my view, Hamilton is somewhat exceptional in that regard, in that devotion to convince his fellow citizens, as he put it, to think continentally.
I'd like to add, in addition to being an immigrant, of all the founding fathers, when, we'll say, the American Revolution began, whether it's when the first Continental Congress meets or Lexington conquered, Hamilton's a nobody. He doesn't come from a famous family like Adams. He's not in government like Washington and Adams and Jefferson. Or Franklin, of course, who's world famous. He comes from maybe not nothing, but he does not come from a wealthy family. He has no name recognition. He enters the army after Lexington and Concord as a private. He's a nobody, and yet he becomes one of the most important founding fathers. And there's nobody else who has that rise from the bottom to the top.
Yeah, to Steve's point about about Hamilton coming here and wanting this to be a continentalist approach, a national approach. Well, Hamilton doesn't have any allegiance to any particular colony, and I think Steve said pretty much that or implied that. I thought that was significant. And on Michael's point, Hamilton was a nobody, but by the end of the war, there was nobody in this country that knew George Washington better than Alexander Hamilton. And I think that set him apart a little bit. Not everybody that was in that cabinet fought in a war. Washington did, Hamilton did, Madison or Jefferson did not. Randolph did not. He was an aide de camp for a couple months, but Hamilton had that brotherhood with Washington, and I think those two together, it just set them apart. And I think Hamilton, as an individual, his knowledge was broad and deep. Maybe he didn't know about agriculture as very much, but there's a lot of people that they're specialists. They're not very broad, but they're narrow, but they're deep. Some people they know a little bit about everything, but when you go deep, they can't do that. I think Hamilton was an exception to that. He was broad and deep.
I agree.
Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%, and that was partly what I was trying to get across in my opening comments. And he understood agriculture well enough for what he wanted to do, which was create a nation. He didn't need to go out and grow corn or whatever with his own hands and understand it at that level, but he understood how it interacted with the other major components of the economy.
The agriculture he saw firsthand was plantation slavery in St. Croix, and he wasn't terribly fond of it.
Yeah, but that's also where Hamilton learned what we could call the economics of agriculture, which is what Bob is really talking about. He didn't know how to plant, or because he never did that, but he understood the economics, the commercialism of it. Well, I was going to add to what Doug said about knowing things broad and deep. Hamilton knew, the ideological, the philosophical aspects of, the revolution and human rights and all that. But he was also very practical or pragmatic, unlike some of the other more utopian kind of founding fathers, if you want to put Jefferson in that group, but definitely like a Thomas Paine. Hamilton had it from all sides. Some were practical, some were philosophical. Hamilton was able to do both.
Not to keep dwelling on this question, but it is an important one. I think of all the founding generation, arguably Hamilton had the most dysfunctional upbringing, and that influences his outlook, his view of the world. The world can be kind of a scary place. Stability, law and order, the rule of law, that can be lost quite quickly. And I think that dysfunctional upbringing shapes Hamilton's view of the world and, leads him to pursue a political order that emphasizes certain elements of permanence and stability.
It also makes him a sucker for women in distress. I mean, he keeps finding his mother, Peggy Arnold, Maria Reynolds.
And so. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Here comes the second one. Do you have any memorable personal stories regarding Alexander Hamilton or visiting a Hamilton-related site?
Possibly in St. Croix. I think it was a trip that Richard was also on many years ago. But viewing the prison cell, I believe, that his mother, Rachel, had been held in for adultery, and hearing the stories, I think, from the park guide that Hamilton used to sit outside the bars and talk to his mother. That really struck me and stayed with me.
Also in St. Croix, when we did our documentary on Hamilton with Michael Pack and Manifold Productions, one of the people we interviewed was a lawyer on St. Croix, and he told me the folk tradition that Hamilton was Black. We sat on a porch one night and talked about this. I brought out a $10 bill and I said, okay, here he is. Here's the guy. What did your grandmother tell you? And he said, well, she didn't say he was Black, but she said he had Black blood. He said she said he was one of us. Now, I don't think that's true, but it's interesting that notion lingers in St. Croix.
I have a funny story. It's more about me than about Hamilton, but Steve will appreciate it. After I gave the lecture I did on the Tomcat story, the Tomcat apparently followed me around everywhere. I was walking in Queens and there was a truck drove by, Tomcat Bakery. And then I went up to Albany for one of the Hamilton events, and I'm in the supermarket, and there's a Tomcat painting on the wall. And it's like this Tomcat's following me everywhere.
For those of you in the public who are not familiar with the Tomcat story, but definitely have heard the story in the musical, both Stephen Knott and Michael Newton have done research debunking the story of the Tomcat in the way that it is presented. So I don't know if Robert, do you have a comment on the question that we have?
Well, I've been to the gravesite, of course, and also to Weehawken, but just up above, not down on the shelf. But of course, the most moving thing for me was to be inside the first Bank of the United States and to appreciate everything that institution did in terms of ensuring that the public credit was strong, as Hamilton wanted and advocated.
Have they restored that? Is that open to the public now?
I should know that because I do live in New Jersey now. I don't live in South Dakota. I don't teach at Augustana anymore. I work at the American Institute for Economic Research in Great Barrington, but have a place on the Jersey Shore. But with COVID, I just have not swung by to check out what's going on. So I don't know, but probably David Cowan or Dick Silla would know best.
I was in conversation with Cindy McPherson. She's the National Park Ranger down there. I was at an event a year or so ago, and they were soliciting funds for that. So it's not open yet. They're trying to pull it all together. And I was just talking to Michael about this a couple of days ago. We were trying to figure out if Alexander Hamilton was ever in that bank, and because it was built after he was Secretary of the Treasury. But I think we kind of concluded that with the number of times that he would have been in Philadelphia while that bank was in existence, it's very likely that he could have been. So I'm trying to document that and get that to Cynthia to say that Hamilton was here too as well.
Well, and Carpenter's Hall is still there, and he was certainly there.
Yep.
By the way, I should point out that when I opened this up and mentioned the story about it, poor Alexander sitting outside the prison gates, one of the listeners pointed out that his mother was imprisoned long before he ever would have been able to sit outside the gates. So here I am trying to debunk myths and spreading them myself. So it's important not to do that. But I have to say it was a hell of a story, and it even brought a tear to my eye. So I'm going to stick with it.
I'll tell you, one of the most moving events that I've ever had with Hamilton was a couple years ago. I was invited by the Army to go down to Fort Benning, Georgia, and they were going to have a sacred soil ceremony. And I had no idea what a sacred soil ceremony was. But I show up to the reception where all these people are at, and there's, name tags, and I see George York Jr. I see Theodore Roosevelt IV. And, it occurred to me a lot of these guys had some, historical families. And this was a graduation ceremony for one of the airborne classes. And so what they did is they invited about 25 of us. And each one of us had, we represented an ancestor of ours or a descendant of ours or an ancestor and the war that particular individual served in. So they started off with the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Yorktown, and I got to represent Hamilton for that. Then next to me was somebody from the War of 1812, and down to the Spanish-American War, the World War I, World War II, all the way down. And they gave each one of us this bucket of dirt. It was dirt, it was soil that had come from the battlefield that our ancestor fought on. And so, I thought, okay, well, this is pretty good. So somebody raises their hand up and says, okay, what are we going to do? And they says, just do what Hamilton does. And so nobody had given me any instructions. So I kind of figured out I'm supposed to walk out. I'm supposed to do an about facing down, pour the dirt on the ground, and then take my position. And they went all the way down and did that. And once that was done, then this graduating class of 18 and 19-year-old kids that are going to be in, I think at the time, Iraq or Afghanistan sometime soon, they come marching by and they march over this dirt. And you tell me about a moving moment. That was it. Those kids were, giving up, sacrificing, potentially their lives to go serve our country. And it was just a great event. And I'm glad that Alexander Hamilton got to lead it off.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Not very uplifting, but it was a great story.
What made Hamilton policies and programs so successful?
Well, Robert can probably speak more knowledgeably to this, but isn't he? I mean, he really sees rather early how the world is going, and not many other countries had preceded us on this path. Modern debt financing, I think, was pioneered in Holland at the end of the 17th century, and then England at the very end of it with the Bank of England. And then France tries it early in the 18th century with John Law, a Scotsman who Hamilton thought had some right ideas, but also some wrong ones, and it backfired spectacularly. I mean, to the extent that French banks today, I understand, rarely call themselves banks. It's Crédit Lyonnais. It's not the Banque de Lyon, because bank still has like a bad sound in French because of this horrible financial backfire. So Hamilton in the United States is really number 3 in this notion of how you can finance debt successfully. I mean, in the past, debt, how did you finance debt? Well, you stole from other people, right? You taxed your citizens rapaciously. You fought wars and took loot and brought it back, and that's how you paid off your debts. Or you didn't, or you just stiffed your creditors. But there was this emerging understanding of, well, there are better ways to manage this, and he's very early in figuring that out.
Yeah, I think you're right, Richard. He's early, but not first. He can look at those precedents in Holland and in Britain and adapt them to U.S. circumstances in the late 1700s. He doesn't have to start from scratch completely, though. And of course, that's where a lot of business people like to be, right? Not at the bleeding edge, because that's where you can make mistakes and lose everything. It's very risky. You want to be, as they often say, a fast second or a close second. So he in a sense was in the right place at the right time in this vigorous young nation that could still be molded, and just with the force of his intelligence and connections, was able to convince key policymakers like Washington that he had the best vision for the country.
Just to build on what Robert just said, none of this happens without George Washington. I know that sort of goes without saying, but I'm going to say it. This really was the indispensable alliance. Hamilton understood this, of course, when Washington passes away in December 1799. He refers to General/President Washington as an aegis, very essential to me, a shield. And he recognizes that without George Washington, none of Hamilton's policies, back to Sergio's question, come to pass, most likely.
I was going to add, in addition to seeing the future, seeing that the world was moving towards finance, commerce, and even manufacturing, Hamilton believed in diversification, which most of the other founding fathers did not. There were some who were the commercial founding fathers, then there were, of course, the lawyers, there were the farmers like Jefferson, believed agriculture should be primary. Hamilton didn't believe people have this misconception. Hamilton believed commerce should be, the most important, or with his report on manufacturers, that manufacturing was more important. But throughout that report, he talks about how manufacturing will help agriculture. And it was all about diversifying the economy, which also had to do with diversifying the revenue stream for the federal government to pay off the debt, establish credit. It was all about diversification. One can argue that, diversification in modern finance didn't really enter as like the primary topic until the 1950s with Harry Markowitz, but we won't get into that. But now diversification, they call it the only free lunch. And Hamilton realized that in, the 1700s. And, Jefferson didn't realize it. I'm not sure about Washington. Washington was very much in favor of internal improvements and commerce, in addition to agriculture. But when you're competing against the Jeffersonians, who are agriculture only, will let England deal with our manufacturing, or even worse, will let France do our manufacturing when they didn't really have any manufacturing. Hamilton realized that we need a diversified economy because we can't rely on people who might end up being an enemy.
I think that Hamilton also had some implementation skills. When he wanted something to get done, he had this sense of, here's some of the things that need to be done. When he set up the revenue cutter service, one of the things he did is he writes this document that says to the guys that are out in the boats, here's how I want you to treat these people that you encounter. And that was read for a long time. And I understand it's still in the Coast Guard book. They read Hamilton's words on here's how you ought to treat the people. But the point is that I think Hamilton knew what it took to get these things implemented, and he went that extra mile to make sure that these ideas got implemented correctly or to his satisfaction.
Thank you so much. And before we move to the next question, I just wanted to make a comment that I believe it was in 2018 that the Independence Historical Trust and the Independence Historical National Historical Park started the efforts to raise money and start a process of restoring the first bank in order to open it to the public. So it's been almost 3 years now that they have been doing that. And I would like to invite the audience to look a Facebook page that is called Restoring the First Bank of the United States, because they have some posts every now and then giving some really interesting and cool updates of the restoration and the things that are going on with the property. And I'm really happy that all of you were mentioning Washington when you were speaking, because the next question that I have for you is, what was so special about the relationship between Washington and Hamilton?
Well, they were father and son, right? It's a joke, everyone. Please, no comments.
Well, it was a remarkably unlikely one. I mean, let's face it, again, this immigrant from a highly dysfunctional background, arguably with a few pennies in his pocket, arrives in the United States and manages through this wartime service to form what I consider to be the most important alliance in American history. And by the way, part of the reason I argue that is because there are plenty of folks who believe it was Jefferson or Madison or maybe John Adams and Jefferson when they got along. But in my view, it is such an unlikely thing that this Virginian member of the Virginia gentry, not that Washington had an easy life, but somehow through that wartime experience, that bond that forms between them changes the whole course of American history. And it's, as Richard, I think, said earlier, it's got every element of drama that you could possibly expect. And again, I think it's the most important alliance in American history.
But to the unlikelihood of it, I think it's not so unlikely since it was Washington was part of it. I mean, it's not just Hamilton that he bonds with. He bonds with Nathaniel Greene, who was an ex-Quaker ironmaster's son from Rhode Island. He bonds with Henry Knox, who's a former bookseller from Boston. He bonds with Baron von Steuben, who can hardly speak English and has to have his swearing translated to the troops. And when Washington gets a letter accusing him of pedophilia back in Germany, Washington ignores it because it's just unsubstantiated gossip, and he sees what Steuben is doing for him. Washington is always looking for results. And Hamilton is one of many people who produce results for him, and in his case, spectacular results. So I don't think it's surprising on Washington's part that he sees this.
Great points, Richard. Great points.
And Stephen, you mentioned the wartime experience. What was Hamilton's job during the war? His job was to be a pen man. He was to take Washington's ideas and put them down on a piece of paper. And there were a lot of aide-de-camps, and they were able to do this, but Hamilton was able to do it particularly well. And I think, that helped build that relationship. That's why Hamilton could never get out of there. Washington was so dependent on him taking what Washington's thinking and getting it down and putting it on a piece of paper. And so it's not a surprise that after the war is over, Washington will still reach out to him, periodically and say, let's talk more about this. And could you write this for me in my, my address to Congress? The John Jay Treaty, I know you left the administration, but could you come back and help me out a little bit with, arguing for the John Jay Treaty? And then the farewell address, it was Washington's address. Hamilton just took what Washington wanted to say and put it down on a piece of paper.
Thank you
and I
so
think
much.
that was special for Washington and Hamilton.
Thank you so much. I would like to pass it on to Nicole right now, who's going to open the floor to the public now.
Yes, I'm happy to report we've had a very active and engaged chat, both with questions and with comments. So one of the questions that we received was, how would you answer the charge that Hamilton was, quote, overly militaristic?
Well, he disarmed that army that President Adams had reluctantly appointed. Well, he appointed George Washington during the quasi-war. We're talking 1798, 99. He appoints Washington as the commander, but Washington insists that Hamilton be, in a sense, his deputy. Once the quasi-war fades, what does Hamilton do? He disarms that army. I mean, if there was ever an opportunity for this budding young Napoleon to overthrow the whole regime, that was it, and it doesn't happen. And I think I've often found folks who make this point that Hamilton was dangerous, that he had this Napoleonic streak. They ignore this fact where he had a chance to do something like that, and there's no evidence whatsoever that it even came close to that. So that would be one of my responses.
Hamilton was a firm believer of peace through strength, an old Roman adage. Washington believed it as well and wrote about it a number of times. When there's various times where Britain threatened or France threatened the United States, Hamilton's like, well, we have to be prepared. We have to form an army. We have to be, have plans to, let's say, invade South America or Florida. He believed in being prepared. That doesn't make him militaristic, as in, I'm going to take over these countries. I'm going to start a war. He wants to be prepared in case that war happens. And what ends up happening is those wars don't happen because we're prepared. And England doesn't come until, of course, Madison's in power. England doesn't come over. France doesn't come over. They attacked on, let's say in the Northwest Territory. There's some squabbling over the forts there. And of course, the military impressment, naval impressment, but they're not going to attack because people like Hamilton got this country prepared for war.
Another point that the Hamilton as militant lobby always raises is the letter that he writes when he's, Michael would know this better, I don't know, 13, 14, whatever, yeah, saying he wishes there was a war. Well, I mean, I don't know about you, but if any of you know teenage boys, that's not an unusual sentiment. to get themselves out of their groveling condition and to wish there was a war. And yet I've seen historians cite this teenage boy's letter as evidence of Hamilton's militarism. It's another one of those pernicious myths.
Didn't Hamilton draft Washington's farewell address?
Yes.
Which is not exactly a militaristic document, right?
Well, and Hamilton was also the
Yeah.
one most strongly arguing for the neutrality, whereas Jefferson and Madison arguing we should be on the side of France, which basically would have gotten the United States into war with Britain. Of course, Washington was definitely leaning in Hamilton's direction, probably would have agreed even if Hamilton wasn't there, but would have he been able to fend off Congress and Jefferson without Hamilton? And then of course Hamilton not only helps writes the proclamation and all that work, he then defends it in the newspapers again. This is not a guy who's seeking war. He wants peace. He wants economic development, financial development. He wants what's best for the United States. And often that means being prepared for war.
I think where Hamilton made a mistake or came closest to making a mistake was at Newburgh at the end of the war in 1783. And the army is, Yorktown is 1781, but it takes over a year and a half for the peace to finally be negotiated. And the army has to continue in existence, and it continues to not be paid. And there's great discontent among the officers. And Hamilton advises Washington, make use of this. You can guide the torrent. And Washington tells him, no, you don't. The army is not something to be played with. And Washington has to tamp this down, which he does in very dramatic fashion with his address to the officers at Newburgh. And I think, Hamilton wasn't angling for a military coup, but he was, thinking, I think, irresponsibly about making use of this officers' discontent in a way that Washington saw, no, you don't want to do that. You don't want to try that. You don't want to go that route. And in fairness to Hamilton, he doesn't. I mean, when Washington says no, Hamilton drops that idea.
There's a great book that came out a couple of years ago by David Head called The Crisis of Peace. We should all read it because it challenges some of the myths, not just about Hamilton, but some of the other myths that have grown up around the whole Newburgh affair. It's called The Crisis of Peace.
I wrote a chapter about it and gave a lecture about it, which I think Sergio said he's going to post in a couple of weeks up at Fort Plain on the Newburgh conspiracy. Mostly on the historiography of the Newburgh conspiracy. Nobody at the time blamed Hamilton for what was happening. After Washington kind of told Hamilton, don't play with the army, I think it's a couple weeks later, he says, oh no, you were right. Basically, Hamilton was warning Washington what was happening in Congress. Washington was up in New York, and Washington didn't actually know everything that was taking place. So whether, you never know what Hamilton's doing behind the scenes or what the people at the time actually blamed the Morrises, what the Morrises were doing behind the scenes. But if Hamilton wasn't there to warn Washington, Washington might not have found out about what was really happening in Philadelphia rather than in Newburgh, and might not have been able to stop it. But it's really the historiography that got me most interested. Hamilton is first blamed by this guy who goes around calling himself John Montgars. And he's making up stories. Oh, it was Robert Morris and Gouverneur Morris and Alexander Hamilton. And then all these people who were there with Washington was like, no, that never happened. And he's like, this guy doesn't even exist. Turns out John Montgars was a guy named John Armstrong, who's the guy who actually wrote the infamous letter that resulted in the whole Newburgh conspiracy, if there even was a conspiracy. And then it goes into the later, more recent historiography. Can't remember the author's name. The guy wrote Eagle and Sword.
Cohn.
Yeah, and Richard Cohn. And and then of course all the quotes of like, this is based on circumstantial evidence. There was no evidence. The evidence is circumstantial. I mean, like 30 different quotes like that. But again, you can never know what's happening behind the scenes. But Washington himself later, after his initial complaint, thanks Hamilton for the information, says, I'm doing exactly what you recommend. So they're in agreement. One can always argue there was stuff going on behind the scenes, but if I'm going to agree with anybody, I'll agree with George Washington.
Well, but let me just say, though, that Washington's strategy and that whole thing is to pull everybody back. And one way he does it is to tell them how patriotic they are. And it's you could say it's shaming, but it's also saying, look, I know all you people, and I know what you've done for 8.5 years. And I know you're better than this, and you're not going to do this. So, I would also look at Washington saying you were right, and take that, not with a grain of salt, but just step back and see this as part of his technique, because he knows these are good guys. These are his comrades. He's fought alongside these men, and he wants to pull them back from any such mistake.
I agree 100% with what Richard just said, but in addition, maybe Washington was trying to refocus the blame. Hamilton, Washington might have said Hamilton was, made a mistake. Maybe he thought that, but he still wanted to please them. But he wanted to focus the blame on the people who were actually doing the wrong.
Right, like Armstrong.
Hamilton, who was trying to do good.
I think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of people don't realize how much both Hamilton and Washington worked together before this time to actually actively travel to other encampments and put down mutinies. These are the kind of things that don't typically get into history books, but through my research, I believe that it might have even been that Hamilton had to leave his honeymoon early to get down and meet with Washington right away to help him put down some mutinies. Hamilton also talked down soldiers that were actually storming what was the capital for the Congress at the time, and talked them down. And so I think that there's a lot of the history that gets left out in the narrative, and certainly not only will we be publishing Michael's extended talk on this, but as the AHA Society, we're always encouraging people to go to the original sources. And I find it very fascinating how often, unfortunately, authors will cherry pick quotes to suit perhaps the narrative that they're telling, but then leave out maybe 2 sentences later a quote that completely contradicts the argument that they're making. So we always encourage people to visit Founders Online. We have such a treasure trove of information, and that's one of the real benefits, that we have access to tens of thousands of these letters back and forth, and that you could go in and read this exchange between Washington and Hamilton about the Newburgh conspiracy, and come to some of your own opinions and learn more. And it's interesting to hear it in their own words. So we always love to encourage that sort of additional investigation of your own, if it's something that, a topic that particularly calls to you.
I'm reviewing a book right now that Nicole, like that just cherry picks things, and this particular author, who is an economist, brings up the whiskey rebellion response as part of this Hamilton as militarist notion, but nobody understands really, or very few people really understand what the whiskey excise tax was all about, and why Hamilton and Washington responded the way that they did. So, but that would get us down a whole other rabbit hole that we can't go down right now.
Well, and I think it circles back to what we were talking about, especially with Hamilton, and persistence of myths, of because so many of his policies and his programs have so much depth and complication and consideration to them, that it can be easy to distill them or soundbite them and not even understand the true impact of them or what was behind them. And so, that's what we always try to bring, is some other perspective. I mean, even his quote, a national debt is a national blessing, conveniently leave off not only the remaining part of that sentence, if it is not excessive, but the whole report is talking about utilizing the debt that was already created to the benefit of the country, not promoting let's rack up debt for the sake of it. So, there's so much that unfortunately that happens. And I do want to fit in a few more audience questions. So let's jump back into that. We do have several questions from attendees asking your all's opinion if Alexander Hamilton had lived and not been killed in 1804 in a duel with Vice President Burr. In your opinion, another 20, 30, let's say 40 years of his life, what do you think Hamilton's future would have been, and what would his impact on American history have been?
I think Hamilton's political future was already dead by 1804. But now the fact that he died so young, prevents us from getting this memoir / political treatise that he talked about writing. That's an incredible loss. But from my perspective, Hamilton and the Federalists were pretty much a done deal by 1804. I'd love to think I was wrong, but I don't think so. Again, I think Jefferson and his party operatives ran circles around the Federalists. And you see it in the fact that the Federalists, by 1816, the Federalists managed to nominate a presidential candidate, but he gets slaughtered. And I don't think Alexander Hamilton at the head of the ticket or pulling the strings behind the scenes would have made any difference at all. So in my view, and this is my view, I know it's not shared by others, he and his party are pretty well done by 1804.
I'm on record saying that if he lives into the 1820s, he becomes a ardent abolitionist and really leads the abolitionist movement, because he was an astute enough student of the economy and all of its sectors, as we discussed earlier, that he would have noticed the increasing divide between economic outcomes in the slave and free states, which was becoming palpable, by the Missouri controversy. So I think if he lives to 1824, he sees it and is speaking out about it. I don't know that would lead to electoral success or anything like that, but I think he would have been a strong early voice for abolition.
So in my opinion, I'd love to hear what Steve has to say about it. When the War of 1812 comes around, and of course the U.S. isn't doing very well at the beginning, Madison would have turned to Hamilton for help. And, he might not have liked him, but he knew Hamilton would have done a good job, maybe not fighting the war, but at least in terms of organizing the army. And now I have no idea if that would have led to Hamilton coming back in politics or would have just been a one-time thing. But I do see Hamilton at least regaining that prominence. Of course, he would have stayed a prominent lawyer in New York and all that, but and maybe had been a kingmaker in local or maybe even national politics by moving some votes. But I think the War of 1812 would have been the key, and then how Hamilton would have played it, or how Madison would have played it. What would have happened to Monroe if Hamilton was kind of leading the effort instead of Monroe? And Monroe maybe doesn't get elected in 1860. Who knows? But I do see Hamilton coming back during that war to at least help.
It's possible that the first bank gets rechartered if Hamilton's still alive. And if it doesn't, it's possible that he goes the route that Biddle goes, at the end of the term of the second bank and creates, essentially a chain bank by chartering the branches in the various states and cobbling it together as a without a federal charter.
I wish I could share the optimism of my fellow Hamiltonians here. I think perhaps my good friends are underestimating the extent to which those myths that we've touched on earlier, the party of the plutocrats, the party of the monarchs, the party of outright British agents, had really taken hold. And I just don't see, either in the ballot box or what Michael suggested, Madison turning to Hamilton. I just don't see it happening. And in fact, what Madison did during the War of 1812 was to turn to political hacks like John Armstrong of Newburgh fame and give him he was Secretary of War. And he's the guy who presides over the burning of the White House. These are the kinds of people that Madison puts in place to conduct that war. And I'm telling you, This country dodged a bullet in that war. We're lucky the British decided to just wash their hands of it, because it was the most poorly conducted war, in my view, in American history.
Well, and I think too that when this question tends to be brought up, people focus a lot on what Hamilton's political career would have been, what his military career, but I think that really people overlook his legal career, and I think it would be really fascinating to know how many more legal precedents that he would have set, even just a few months before he died in the People versus Cromwell, hopefully I have that name right, you know, establishing a precedent for freedom of the press and libel, and that inherently had a huge impact and influence on you know, US law diverging from British law in that regard. And so I think there might have been a lot more in the legal realm that we would have seen, if not political and militarily. We have another great question here, circling back to political. Asking a little, wanting to dive into the Constitutional Convention and Hamilton's famed 6-hour speech proposing a form of government that some have deemed almost monarchical. And so the question here is, did he mean it, or was it a red herring to make the proposed plan under Madison seem less radical? Was it political strategy, or do you think he actually supported the ideas that he was sharing that day?
I think it was political. I don't think that that Hamilton was serious about it. He gave the presentation, but it was never voted on. Nobody, there was no discussion about it. There's a book that I've been referencing lately called In Madison's Hand, talking about Madison and his notes from the Constitutional Convention. And, you know, it turns out that between 1790 and when he died in, I think, 1840, something like that, he made a few edits to that document. And Hamilton's son, John Church, caught him on it. And in that book, the author did a great job, I think, because she said what I wanted her to say. But she says that this was a plan. Hamilton was supposed to get up there and show something a little bit more to the right side than what they wanted the Virginia plan to look like, a moderate plan. And so, you know, what I've read there, it was part of the plan, but, you know, Jefferson or Madison, you know, made some changes, and I think he was caught on it, but he's dead now. So, you know, that was published after his death. So look, I think it was just, it was positioning.
I think Hamilton was determined to inject as many elements of permanence and stability, as I mentioned earlier, into this new Constitution. The track record of republics over history had not been a great one. He knew that history, plus his own personal upbringing, his faith, or his belief in the importance of the rule of law, led him to propose things along the way that good Democrats like Thomas Paine and perhaps Thomas Jefferson and some others viewed as being too British, leaning too much in a sort of monarchical direction. But I think their assessment of Hamilton as a monarchist is completely off the mark. They misunderstood, or actually, I'm not even going to give them that credit. I think they knew better, but knew the political potency of labeling Hamilton as a monarchist or as a British agent. And it was highly potent. But in fact, what Hamilton was trying to do throughout his political career, as I said, was to invest these elements of stability and permanence into a system that the outcome was not at all guaranteed. Okay, and by the way, here we are in 2021, and I would argue it's still not guaranteed.
Thank you, Stephen. And speaking of British agent, we all know that Alexander Hamilton was the original 007.
That is correct.
For those of you
Julian
that might
Boyd
not
said,
know.
agent, yeah. The editor of the Thomas Jefferson Papers writes a small book in the 60s or 70s, or maybe I don't know when it was, accusing Hamilton of being a British agent. Remarkable.
And his code for some diplomatic correspondence was 007 in reality.
I think it was 7, but.
Okay.
Not quite as
We'll add the
sexy.
double O. We'll add the double O. And before we go
The
into
story's better with the double O.
It is. It is.
Before we go on to the next question, I do just want to give another very big thank you to Richard Brookhiser, who was only able to join us for the first hour, but we thank all our panelists for continuing to join us as we have a couple more questions before we wrap up. We have a question here for you, Doug. How is your family or yourself personally handling the newfound fame pop culture moment of Hamilton following the explosion of the Hamilton musical?
Well, I'm not getting rap lessons or any bebop stuff. I haven't gone that far yet, but I think it's with the musical, comes a lot of, they had to cut some corners there, and so not everything that comes from that musical is exactly right. And so, in a lot of cases, we spend time, saying, well, you know what, that wasn't wrong. What do they say? Did Eaker shoot on 7? Because when they did the musical, they show it Eaker shooting early or something like that. Well, no, I don't think that's how it happened. But we spend a little bit of time, defending what the truth is. So it's it's research time on our part. So if nothing else, that's what we're focused on. I mean, it's a musical. I'm glad that people enjoy it. We promote it because it's opened up the discussion at so many levels about this time period, which a lot of people want to cancel right now. So I think it's helping to promote more knowledge of that particular period of time in our history.
Thank you. We also have, unfortunately, we won't get to all our questions this evening, but I do want to wrap up with a question asking about, as we've talked a lot about politics, and how much leverage did Hamilton have in the 1790 dinner bargain, quote unquote, considering the Philadelphia Potomac residents question had already had a considerable agreement?
Well, I mean, he had the leverage of being the president's man in a sense. I mean, I know Jefferson was in the cabinet, but probably even by this early point, Jefferson realized that Washington tended to lean towards Hamilton in these big disputes. So part of what always assisted Hamilton in any policy dispute, including this one, was, the awareness in the room or in the Congress that Washington had, Hamilton had Washington's ear.
I don't know the answer to the question, but I'll just say I question the story as it is told. The way Jefferson tells it about Hamilton wandering around aimlessly, disheveled. I mean, just doesn't sound true, and there's nothing to corroborate it. The story of this dinner with Madison and some others, yet nobody else writes about it. So it's just, I would say there's more questions about this story than there are answers. As the question, whoever asked the question, obviously knows, these discussions were already ongoing. I think if this dinner never happened, the result would have been the same. The capital would have been moved to Philadelphia temporarily, and then to Washington, D.C., what became Washington, D.C. But even this dinner and this compromise and agreement, didn't really finalize things. Took years. They were, the people in Virginia were worried that Philadelphia would keep the capital. That was one of the main reasons they opposed the Bank of the United States. Is not even so much that they opposed the bank, is that if the bank's established in Philadelphia, how are you going to move the capital when the bank's in Philadelphia? So there was all this maneuvering that went on for years. It ends up being that they rush to try to, to make plans to develop Washington, D.C., to start building Washington, D.C. Of course, they leave that to the Secretary of State is in charge, who's Jefferson. He does a terrible job. The capital, nothing's built basically by the time they move there. But it was this, it wasn't just one dinner solved everything. There were negotiations before, the maneuvering continued for years afterwards. And, people like stories, like Homer Simpson says, I like stories. this is a story people like. How much of it's true, I have no idea. I'm sure there are elements that are true, but the story as it's told, we can't believe it as is. And, and it wasn't the first word and it wasn't the final word.
Well, and I just want to add what's really fascinating, again, going back to looking at primary sources, not only those that were written 30 years after the dinner, quote unquote, occurred, but what happened, what were the correspondence in that time? And as much as The Room Where It Happened and the musical is one of my personal favorite songs, and I want to add our partners at the Morris-Jumel Mansion, Meg is reminding us that that song was written in the home. So if you haven't had a chance to visit in person, I hope you all have a chance to someday. But again, this whole story, and one of the reasons I love the song is that, Thomas said, so even, Lynn is recognizing that this is all coming from Jefferson's perspective, written, I think about 30 years later, or however, several decades later. If you go back and even just look at Jefferson's correspondence and between Madison, you'll get a whole different story. It has nothing to do with what he, wrote later. And in fact, it wasn't just one dinner. They had one dinner with the New Jersey delegates. They had one dinner with the Philadelphia delegates. They had one dinner. So it was multiple dinners. It was many people involved. And so the whole, as great as a story it is, and as many books have been written just about that one dinner that likely didn't happen based on the correspondence that Jefferson himself maintained at the time. It just really, again, highlights how, we always have to be careful with what stories we're telling and what the sources are to make sure
the dinner. Sorry, Nicole.
No, go ahead.
The dinner took place in 1790, and Jefferson writes this little story in 1810. And of course, one of the great tragedies of, there are many tragedies in Hamilton's early death. Not to mention, the impact on his family first and foremost. But, had Hamilton lived, we asked this question earlier, and had he been able to counter the tales spun by both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, by the way, who outlived Hamilton by, 22 years or whatever, that's, is a real loss to history. It's unfortunate that these are the kinds of stories that many Americans have been taught, and as Michael pointed out, so many of them are filled with holes.
Absolutely. Well, and with that, I just have to say this highlights how important all of you are for being with us, for sharing, for spending so many decades researching and being able to provide more historical accuracy, provide this context that unfortunately some people don't have access to. And so we're so grateful to you all for joining us. And the best way to celebrate Hamilton's birth and his legacy is by sharing more accurate information about his life. And we want to thank you all as the audience for joining us, learning more about Hamilton, caring about sharing his legacy. We do hope that you'll consider becoming a member of the AHA Society. You can do so and support the work that we do with the Hamilton Grange, with researchers, with authors, everything that we do to try to further this information about Hamilton and make the information accessible to all. Again, you can learn more about membership at the ahasociety.org. That's AHA for Alexander Hamilton Awareness. And we do hope that you will follow our speakers. We did put their social handles in the chat, and you can also find out more about them on our website. And again, I just want to thank you on behalf of the AHA Society Board, on behalf of our many partners that came together to celebrate Hamilton's birthday. Happy 10th annual Happy Birthday Hamilton. And we hope to stay connected with you and continue celebrating him. With that, I'll say good evening and thank you so much.